The brass key. The mundane mistake that sank a Titan. We all know the story. The unsinkable behemoth. The freezing Atlantic. The band playing on the slanted deck as the stern rose into the night sky. It is the most famous maritime disaster in human history. For over a century, we've blamed the ice. We've blamed the captain's arrogance, the severe lack of lifeboats, and the reckless speed of the vessel through a known ice field. And honestly, if you read the official inquiry transcripts from 1912, that is exactly the narrative you are supposed to believe. But the truth is, disasters of this magnitude rarely start with a massive cinematic collision. They start quietly. They start with a mundane, everyday mistake, a misread memo, a rushed handover, or in this case, a guy packing his bags in a hurry, completely unaware that he was sealing the fate of over 1,500 people. Pause. To understand what actually happened out there in the dark, we have to go back, not to the freezing ocean, but to a damp, foggy morning in Southampton, England. April 1912. Meet David Blair. David is 37 years old. He's a career mariner, a guy who has spent his entire adult life working his way up the ranks of the White Star Line. And right now, he is having the absolute best week of his life. He has just been appointed as the second officer on the newest, largest, most luxurious ocean liner ever constructed by human hands. For weeks, David has been living and breathing this ship. He's been overseeing the final preparations, making sure the navigation equipment is calibrated, double-checking the inventory. It's tedious, unglamorous work. You can imagine him sitting in his cramped cabin, drinking stale, lukewarm coffee, checking off cargo manifests under the dim, buzzing glow of an incandescent bulb. One of David's specific responsibilities is the ship's optical equipment, the binoculars. Out on the open ocean, especially at night, binoculars are the only early warning system a ship has. There's no radar, there's no sonar, just two guys freezing in a crow's nest, staring out into the blackness, relying on magnified glass. Because the ship is still in port, and there are hundreds of contractors, dock workers, and crew members swarming the decks, things have a habit of walking off. So, David does what any responsible officer would do. He takes the ship's high-powered binoculars, locks them securely in a wooden cabinet in the crow's nest, and slips the small 3-inch brass key into the pocket of his heavy wool uniform coat. It's a totally normal thing to do. Think about how many times you've slipped your house keys or your car keys into your pocket without even registering the movement. It's pure muscle memory. And at that point, it made perfect sense. The binoculars were safe. David had the key. The grandest ship in the world was set to sail in just a few days. But then, the corporate machines stepped in. It's April 9th, less than 24 hours before the maiden voyage. The executives at the White Star Line make a sudden, 11th-hour decision. They are nervous about the sheer, unprecedented size of this new vessel, so they decide to bring in a more senior officer from a sister ship to act as chief officer. Because of this sudden corporate shuffle, everyone in the senior staff gets bumped down a rank, and David Blair, he's the odd man out. He is abruptly removed from the crew roster. Imagine the crushing disappointment. You've spent weeks preparing this magnificent vessel. You've bragged to your family, your friends, and less than a day before you're supposed to make history, your boss taps you on the shoulder and says, "Sorry, David, pack your things. You're not going." David is devastated. And honestly, he's probably pretty angry. He goes to his cabin, he starts throwing his belongings into his canvas duffel bag, he's rushing. He just wants to get off the ship, get away from the awkward, pitying stares of his colleagues, and go home. He strips off his working coat, packs his gear, and hastily briefs his replacement, an officer named Charles Lightoller. It's a messy, rushed handover. A 15-minute tense conversation over a cluttered desk littered with shipping charts and half-empty teacups. David grabs his bags, walks down the gangway, and steps back onto the cobblestone docks of Southampton. He watches the massive black hull of the ship towering over him, probably feeling a bitter mix of relief and profound loss. What David Blair doesn't realize as he walks away, what he won't realize until days later, when the horrifying news hits the telegraph wires, is that he forgot to hand something over to his replacement. Sitting at the bottom of his coat pocket, entirely forgotten in the emotional chaos of his sudden firing, is a tiny 3-inch brass key, the only key to the binocular locker. The 10th of April, 1912. The grandest ship in human history pulls away from the docks of Southampton. The crowds are cheering, the brass bands are playing, and deep in the bowels of the ship, the massive engines hum to life. For the first few days, everything is perfect. The voyage is a triumph of modern engineering. But as the ship pushes further into the North Atlantic, the atmosphere begins to shift. Fast forward to the evening of April 14th. Imagine being Frederick Fleet or Reginald Lee, the two lookouts assigned to the night watch. You've just climbed a 50-foot steel ladder in the freezing dark to reach the crow's nest, a tiny exposed metal basket swaying high above the deck. The wind is biting, cutting right through your heavy wool coat. Your job is simple but critical. Stare out into the pitch-black ocean and look for danger. Naturally, the first thing Fleet does is reach for the wooden locker where the binoculars are supposed to be kept. He jiggles the handle. It's locked tight. He calls down to the bridge. He asks the officers for the glasses. But down on the bridge, Charles Lightoller, the officer who hastily replaced David Blair, is coming up empty. He searches the drawers, sifts through the cluttered desks, but he can't find the key. He probably assumed the binoculars were packed away in the cargo hold, or maybe misplaced during the messy, rushed handover in Southampton. And honestly, at that moment, nobody panicked. They just brushed it off. This is where the false sense of security really takes hold. If you look at the standard operating procedures of 1912, the officer's reaction makes total logical sense. The prevailing belief was that lookouts should rely entirely on their naked eyes to spot an object. Binoculars, they argued, narrowed your field of vision too much. They were only supposed to be used to times confirm times what you had already seen. Besides, they were standing on 46,000 tons of unsinkable steel. And the weather? It was absolutely perfect. There was no moon that night, but the sky was remarkably clear, completely packed with stars. The ocean was dead calm, flat as a piece of glass. The crew figured that if there was a massive block of ice in their path, it would be impossible to miss. They would see the stars blocked out by its massive silhouette. They would see the white foam of waves crashing against its base. They didn't need binoculars, they had perfect conditions. But that comforting, logical explanation was about to shatter. Because the truth was, those perfect conditions were actually a death trap. The fact that the ocean was completely flat wasn't a blessing. It was a fatal curse. Without wind or swells, there were no waves to crash against the edges of the icebergs. There was no white foam to catch the starlight. It was just dark ice sitting motionless in dark water. And it gets worse. The ship was sailing into a region where the freezing Labrador Current collided with the warmer Gulf Stream. This extreme temperature drop created a phenomenon known as a thermal inversion, a cold water mirage. The freezing air literally bent the starlight, creating a false horizon that crept up into the sky, camouflaging everything behind it. Up in the crow's nest, Fleet and Lee are staring out into a pitch-black abyss, their eyes watering from the freezing wind. They are trying to pierce through a visual distortion they don't even know exists. If they had those high-powered binoculars, they could have cut through the mirage. They could have magnified the faint, starlit outline of the threat miles ahead. They would have had minutes to react instead of seconds. But they don't. Because hundreds of miles away, back in England, a disappointed man named David Blair is sitting in his home, completely unaware that the 3-inch brass key resting in his coat pocket has just doomed them all. And right now, the ship is barreling forward at 22 knots, about 25 miles per hour, straight into an invisible, frozen minefield. At exactly 11:40 p.m., the mirage finally breaks. Up in the freezing crow's nest, lookout Frederick Fleet's eyes widen. Out of the pitch-black abyss, a massive dark shadow suddenly materializes in their path. It isn't white. It isn't gleaming. It's a black mountain of ancient ice, dead ahead, and it's less than a quarter of a mile away. Fleet lunges for the brass bell, striking it 3 sharp times the universal warning for danger ahead. He grabs the telephone, his hands shaking from the biting cold, and screams down to the bridge. "Iceberg, right ahead!" First Officer William Murdoch immediately orders the wheel hard over and throws the engine telegraph into reverse. But physics is a cruel master. You cannot simply stop 46,000 tons of steel barreling forward at 25 miles per hour. It takes agonizing, breathless seconds for the massive rudder to even begin to turn the ship. They almost clear it. Almost. And here is where the reality of the disaster severely diverges from the movies. There was no massive cinematic crash. There was no explosive impact that threw people out of their beds. In fact, most passengers barely noticed it. Survivors later described it as a faint shudder, a dull, grinding noise like a giant finger dragging along the side of the hull. One passenger said, "It sounded like tearing a piece of calico cloth." Down in the boiler rooms, the stokers saw a sudden spray of freezing water, but up in the first-class cabins, people just rolled over and went back to sleep. And honestly, that is the most terrifying part of this whole story. The sheer, quiet normalcy of the moment they were doomed. Because below the waterline, the ice wasn't slicing the steel open like a can opener. The immense pressure was simply popping the iron rivets out of the hull plates. The seams buckled, and the freezing ocean began pouring into 5 separate watertight compartments. When the ship's chief designer, Thomas Andrews, was called to the bridge to assess the damage, he didn't need a long time to figure it out. The math was brutally simple. The ship was designed to stay afloat, with up to 4 compartments flooded. But 5? 5 meant the bow would be pulled down, and the water would simply spill over the bulkheads into the next compartment, and the next, and the next. It was a mathematical certainty. The unsinkable ship was going to the bottom of the ocean. And it is only now, as the distress rockets are fired into the indifferent, star-filled sky, that the full, crushing weight of history sets in. Because this isn't just an anonymous vessel. The ship, bleeding out in the freezing dark of the North Atlantic, is the RMS Titanic. Think about the sheer emotional horror of the next 2 hours. The realization creeping through the grand staircases and the third-class steerage, the 2 8-degree water so cold it felt like 1,000 knives piercing the skin, slowly rising deck by deck. The horrifying realization that there were over 2,200 souls on board and only enough lifeboats for half of them. And then, think about David Blair. Days later, Blair is sitting in his quiet, safe home in England. He probably has a cup of morning tea or stale coffee on the table. He unfolds the morning newspaper, and his heart stops. The bold black ink screams the unimaginable. Titanic sinks. 1,500 dead. He reads the horrifying accounts. The lack of warning. The lookouts who couldn't see the iceberg until it was too late. He reaches into his coat pocket. His fingers brush against cold, heavy brass. The 3-inch key. Did David Blair sink the Titanic? No. The thermal mirage, the speed, the flat ocean, the brittle iron rivets, it was a catastrophic cascade of failures. But human minds don't process tragedy like a math equation. We look for the what if. What if Blair had remembered to hand over the key? What if Fleet and Lee had those binoculars? What if they had seen the black ice just 10 seconds earlier? 10 seconds is all it would have taken to turn the rudder just a few more feet. 10 seconds to save 1,500 lives. Blair kept that key for the rest of his life, a heavy, silent ghost in his pocket. Today, 2.5 miles down at the bottom of the North Atlantic, the Titanic rests in total, crushing darkness. Deep inside the decaying wreckage, buried in a collapsed officer's cabin, there is a small wooden locker. Inside that locker, perfectly preserved in the freezing depths, sits a pair of high-powered binoculars. They have been waiting there for over a century, waiting for a little brass key that never came. The impossible shot, the yellow Camaro mystery. Imagine you are driving down a perfectly flat, sun-baked stretch of interstate. It is 2:14 p.m. on a Tuesday, broad daylight. You are in a bright yellow 1978 Chevy Camaro. The windows are rolled up tight against the Texas heat, the AC blasting. There are no other cars within a quarter mile. And then, out of nowhere, you just die. No screeching tires, no erratic swerving. Your foot simply slips off the gas, the car drifts lazily into a drainage ditch, and that is it. When the paramedics arrive, they assume it is a heart attack. A tragic, mundane medical emergency. But then they roll you onto the stretcher, and they find it. A perfectly circular 38 caliber hole in the back of your head. No exit wound, no shattered glass anywhere in the car. No one heard a gunshot. Welcome to what investigators still call the weirdest murder case in American history. But before we get into the impossible ballistics of it all, we need to talk about the man in the Camaro. His name was David. He was 42, a mid-level regional manager for a paper supply company, living in a quiet subdivision just outside of Austin, Texas. And honestly, David's life was the definition of ordinary. The morning of June 12th started like any other. We know this because investigators meticulously reconstructed his last 24 hours. They found a half-empty mug of stale coffee on his kitchen counter, right next to a stack of unopened junk mail, mostly credit card pre-approvals, and a flyer for a local hardware store. He had kissed his wife goodbye at 7:30 a.m., complained about the humidity, and drove to work. He was the kind of guy who kept a meticulous ledger of his gas mileage in the glove box. He was not involved in gangs. He did not owe money to the mob. He was just a regular guy looking forward to mowing his lawn on the weekend. Which brings us back to 2:14 p.m. David was leaving a client meeting, cruising down Route 290 at exactly 55 miles per hour. A highway patrol officer, Deputy Miller, happened to be parked on the gravel shoulder running radar about a half mile away. Miller did not hear a pop. He did not see a muzzle flash. He just saw the bright yellow Camaro slowly drift across the solid white line, rumble over the shoulder, and nosedive into a shallow embankment. It was so slow, so anticlimactic, that Miller did not even hit his sirens. He just flipped on his lights and rolled over, expecting to find a guy who fell asleep at the wheel or maybe had low blood sugar. Miller walked up to the driver's side. The car was still in drive, the tires spinning lazily in the dirt. David was slumped over the steering wheel, no blood on the dashboard, no visible trauma, just a guy taking an involuntary nap. And at that point, it made perfect sense. A medical episode. But when Miller opened the heavy metal door and reached in to check for a pulse on David's neck, his fingers brushed against something wet. Hidden just beneath David's hairline, at the base of his skull, was a small, neat puncture wound. The kind of hole that completely shattered the quiet afternoon. A bullet wound inside a sealed car with absolutely no explanation. When Deputy Miller felt that warm, sticky blood at the base of David's skull, the entire nature of the scene shifted. It wasn't a medical rescue anymore. It was a homicide investigation. Within 20 minutes, that quiet stretch of Route 290 was swarming with flashing red and blue lights. Crime scene tape was strung up between the scrub oaks, flapping lazily in the heavy 8-degree Texas heat. And honestly, when the crime scene technicians first arrived, they assumed it would be an open and shut case, a drive-by shooting on the highway. It happens. It's tragic, but it makes physical sense. You look for the shattered window, you dig the bullet out of the dashboard, you check the asphalt for shell casings, but as the tech team began processing David's yellow Camaro, that sense of routine completely evaporated. First, they checked the windows. Both the driver and passenger side windows were rolled up tight. The air conditioning was still blasting cold air into the cabin. There was no shattered glass on the upholstery, no spiderweb cracks in the windshield. So, they checked the body of the car. They ran their hands over the heavy steel doors, the trunk lid, the rear bumper, looking for a puncture. Nothing. Not a single scratch on the bright yellow paint. At that point, the lead investigator, a 20-year veteran named Detective Eris, arrived on the scene. And Eris did what any logical detective would do when faced with an impossible external shot. He looked inward. If the bullet didn't come from the outside, it had to come from the inside. It's a dark thought, but it was the only explanation that held water. David must have pulled the trigger himself. Maybe the stress of his mid-level management job got to him. Maybe that ledger in the glove box hid financial ruin. They began tearing the interior apart. They checked under the heavy rubber floor mats. They sifted through the crumpled fast food wrappers in the passenger footwell. They emptied the center console, pulling out nothing but a handful of sticky pennies and a spare tire gauge. They were looking for a gun, a 38 caliber revolver, maybe a small semi-automatic pistol. They found absolutely nothing. Which brings us to the collapse of the suicide theory. Later that evening, the county medical examiner, Dr. Evans, conducted the autopsy. He recovered the bullet, a slightly deformed .38 caliber slug lodged deep in David's frontal lobe. But it was the trajectory that made Dr. Evans pick up the phone and call Detective Eris in the middle of the night. The bullet had entered the exact center of the back of David's head, right at the medulla, and traveled on a slightly upward trajectory. Think about the physics of that for a second. Try to imagine a man driving 55 miles per hour down a highway, reaching around to the back of his own head with a .38 caliber handgun, angling it upward, pulling the trigger, and then, what? Throwing the gun out of a closed window? Swallowing it? It was physically impossible. So, if it wasn't suicide, there was only one other logical option left on the board: the passenger theory. Someone else was in the car with David. Someone sitting in the back seat who quietly raised a gun, pulled the trigger, and bailed out of the moving vehicle before Deputy Miller arrived. It made sense. It felt like a solid, grounded theory. Until Detective Eris went back to the impound lot to review the vehicle logs. When Deputy Miller first approached the Camaro, the doors weren't just closed, they were locked. From the inside. The electronic locks were engaged, and the rear doors had the child safety locks switched on. Furthermore, the thick layer of Texas dust on the back seats was completely undisturbed. No one had sat back there in weeks. So there they were. Investigators were staring at a locked metal box. A man had been shot in the back of the head with a .38 caliber bullet. The gun wasn't inside the car. The bullet couldn't have come from outside the car. There was no ghost passenger. It was a locked room mystery doing 55 miles per hour down a Texas highway. And the truth, when they finally uncovered it, was so bizarre, so statistically improbable, that they had to Brauhausist just to prove it actually happened. It took 3 weeks and a team of forensic engineers to finally look under the car. And honestly, you can't blame Detective Eris for missing it. You don't look for a gunshot wound to originate from the asphalt. But when they put that yellow Camaro on a hydraulic lift at the county garage, the impossible suddenly became physical. There, just behind the rear axle, punched through the rusted metal of the undercarriage, was a hole. A perfect, hidden circular hole no wider than a pencil eraser. They traced the trajectory. The bullet had traveled up through the floorboard, pierced the thin metal of the trunk pan, passed cleanly through the foam stuffing of the driver's seat, and entered the base of David's skull. But how? A. .38 caliber bullet doesn't just fire itself from the highway, which brings us to a 19-year-old kid named Michael living exactly 1.2 miles away from Interstate 45. That afternoon, Michael was in his backyard, messing around with his grandfather's .38 caliber revolver. He wasn't aiming at the highway, he wasn't aiming at anything in particular. He just pointed the gun at a makeshift target on a dead tree stump and pulled the trigger. But he missed. The bullet struck a rusted cast iron pipe buried in the dirt. And at that exact moment, physics took over. The bullet ricocheted off the iron. It launched into the air at a steep angle, traveling in a massive parabolic arc over the Texas scrubland. It cleared a line of oak trees. It crossed over a mile of empty fields. And right as it began its descent, losing speed but still carrying lethal kinetic energy, it met Interstate 45 at the exact millisecond that David's yellow Camaro passed over that specific patch of asphalt. The bullet didn't drop onto the roof. It ricocheted a second time off the concrete highway, bouncing upward just as the Camaro drove over it. It punched through the rusted floorboard, through the seat, and into David. A true locked room mystery solved by a 1 in a trillion freak accident. When Detective Eris finally drove out to Michael's house and explained what had happened, the kid just collapsed on the front porch. He hadn't even known. He had been eating dinner with his family while David was bleeding out on the steering wheel. And that's the part that really lingers. The emotional aftermath of a truth this bizarre. For David's family, there was no villain to hate. No grand conspiracy to unravel. Just a cosmic, terrifying roll of the dice. You send your husband off to work, and he doesn't come home because a teenager missed a tree stump a mile away. It strips away the illusion of safety we all build for ourselves. You can lock your doors, you can wear your seatbelt, you can drive exactly 55 miles per hour, but you can't control the random geometry of the universe. And honestly, there's one final detail that Detective Eris still thinks about years later. When they checked David's receipt from the fast food drive-thru he had visited just before getting on the highway, they noticed the timestamp. David had been handed his change, a handful of sticky pennies, and he had fumbled with them, dropping one between the seats. The cashier remembered him putting the car in park, unbuckling his belt, and spending exactly 12 seconds fishing that penny out from under the emergency brake. 12 seconds. If David had just left the penny on the floor, if he had merged onto the highway 12 seconds earlier or 12 seconds later, that .38 caliber bullet would have hit empty asphalt. Instead, he arrived at that exact square foot of highway at the exact millisecond required to intercept a falling piece of lead. Sometimes the scariest stories aren't the ones about monsters or serial killers. Sometimes they're just about a yellow car, a hidden hole, and a 12-second delay. The Echo Chamber, the ironic death of Marcus Vance. If you were to pull the Highway Patrol report from the 14th of October, 2004, it reads like 100 other tragic accidents on Route 315 out of Columbus, Ohio. A 1,998 Ford Taurus. A slick patch of asphalt. A sudden loss of control at 65 miles per hour. But what the sterile, typewritten report doesn't mention is what the paramedics found sitting on the passenger seat, dusted with shattered safety glass. It was a manuscript, 300 pages of heavily annotated drafts written by the driver himself. A manuscript dedicated entirely to proving that the exact mechanism that just caused his death was a manufactured hoax. And honestly, when you realize who was behind the wheel, the story stops being a standard roadside tragedy. It becomes something almost uncomfortably ironic. Something that makes you wonder if the universe has a very dark sense of humor. Is less than BR, is greater than is less than BR, is greater than. The man in the driver's seat was Marcus Vance. If you read any local investigative pieces in the late 90s, you probably knew his byline. Marcus wasn't one of those polished, TV-ready journalists. He was the kind of guy who practically lived in a cramped, poorly lit office above a strip mall, surviving on stale black coffee from the diner next door and cheap antacids. His desk was an archaeological dig of junk mail, half-empty styrofoam cups, and stacks of Freedom of Information Act requests. He was deeply flawed, often missing his daughter's soccer games because he was chasing a lead, but he genuinely believed he was doing the right thing. He saw himself as the ultimate skeptic. The guy who would protect the American public from corporate overreach. For the last 2 years, Marcus had been consumed by a singular obsession. He was convinced that a major safety initiative, one that was being heavily lobbied for in Washington, was actually a multi-million-dollar scam designed to prey on consumer fear. He wouldn't shut up about it. He'd corner his editors, waving dog-eared printouts, arguing that the statistics were manipulated. He felt he was on the verge of the biggest exposé of his career. Is less than BR, is greater than, is less than BR, is greater than. Which brings us to the morning of the 14th. It was a Tuesday, unseasonably cold, with that heavy gray Midwestern sky that makes everything look a little washed out. Marcus was running late. He had a meeting downtown with a whistleblower, someone who supposedly had the smoking gun documents he needed to finish his book. As he backed his Taurus out of his suburban driveway, crushing a pile of damp autumn leaves, there was a sound. A sharp, metallic clink, followed by a faint, rhythmic vibration right beneath the steering column. Most people would have pulled over. Most people would have checked it out. But Marcus had spent the last 24 months convincing himself that the automotive industry was lying about this exact type of mechanical failure. He had internalized his own reporting so deeply that he actually believed the danger was statistically impossible. So he just reached over, turned up the volume on the radio, and merged onto the highway. He didn't know it yet, but that little vibration was the sound of a very real, very fatal reality catching up to him. 10 miles down Interstate 90, that faint, rhythmic vibration had evolved into a dull, persistent shudder. You know that feeling when you're driving at 65 miles per hour and something just feels off in the floorboards? It travels up through your boots, settling right into your teeth. Marcus felt it. He gripped the cold, faux leather steering wheel a little tighter, his knuckles turning white. But he didn't slow down. He was too busy rehearsing his interview questions, muttering them aloud over the sound of the morning radio traffic report. End. Honestly, you can almost understand his mindset. When you spend 2 years of your life staring at corporate memos and convincing yourself that a specific mechanical defect is a complete fabrication, a phantom menace invented by lobbyists to push a multi-million-dollar mandatory, recall you refuse to see the ghost when it's sitting right next to you in the passenger seat. N by 8:22 a.m. The shutter became a hard, aggressive pull to the right. The car was actively fighting him. N. Now, any normal person would have thrown on their hazard lights and pulled over to the shoulder. But Marcus needed a logical, mundane explanation that didn't threaten his entire worldview. He rationalized it. Of course he did. He told himself it was just a bad alignment. He remembered hitting a massive pothole outside the diner a few weeks back, the kind that rattles your teeth and spills your coffee. Or maybe it was a warped brake rotor. Yes, that made perfect sense. It was an old car, with over 120,000 miles on the odometer. Cars get old, parts wear out. It was just a routine maintenance issue, nothing more. He convinced himself he could just muscle it to the downtown exit and drop it off at a mechanic after he got his smoking gun documents. N. It's terrifying how easily we can rationalize our own impending doom just to protect our ego. And the real collapse of his reality happened exactly 3 miles later at the exit 42 off-ramp. It's one of those sweeping, downhill cloverleaf curves that forces you to lean heavily into the turn. Marcus eased off the gas, dropping his speed to about 45 miles per hour, and firmly turned the steering wheel to the right. N. But the Taurus didn't turn. N. The heavy, reassuring resistance of the steering column vanished instantly. The wheel just spun in his hands, completely loose, rotating freely like a plastic toy on a playground. There was a sickening snap, the unmistakable sound of the steering linkage completely shearing off from the axle. End quote. In that fraction of a second, the truth shattered his false explanation. The mythical defect, the exact one he was about to expose as a statistical impossibility in his upcoming book, was happening right now in his own car. He slammed on the brakes, but physics had already taken over. 2 tons of American steel plowed straight ahead, ignoring the curve of the ramp. The car burst through the metal guardrail with a deafening metallic shriek, launching into the steep, weed-choked embankment below. The world turned into a chaotic blur of shattered safety glass, deploying airbags, and the violent, bone-rattling impact of the car slamming into a thick concrete drainage culvert. Then. Silence. Just the hiss of a punctured radiator and the smell of burnt gunpowder from the airbag deployment, and Marcus was bleeding, disoriented, and trapped in the crushed cabin. But miraculously, he was still breathing. He had survived the impossible crash. As he sat there, coughing in the smoke, a twisted sense of relief washed over him. He was alive. But what Marcus didn't realize as he reached for the door handle was that the crash wasn't the tragedy. The crash was just the setup for the darkest, most ironic punchline the universe could possibly deliver. Marcus pushed against the driver's side door. It was wedged shut, crumpled against the thick, immovable concrete of the culvert. No big deal, he probably thought. He'd just climb over the center console and get out through the passenger side. He reached down to unclick his seatbelt. He pressed the red button. It didn't move. He pressed harder, his thumb turning white with the strain. Nothing. The plastic button was completely rigid, feeling as though it had been welded into the metal housing. And honestly, this is the part of the story where the universe stops being random and starts feeling downright malicious. You see, the steering linkage failure wasn't the only anomaly Marcus was dedicating his book to debunking. The whistleblowers leaked documents, the very ones Marcus was so desperate to prove were fabricated, detailed, a fatal, cascading failure. The claim was that when the Taurus experienced a severe front-end collision, the immense kinetic energy would warp the floor pan just enough to jam the seatbelt retractor and fuse the buckle mechanism completely shut. Marcus had spent an entire chapter of his upcoming book tearing this specific claim apart. I actually have a copy of the original manuscript right here. On page 142, he calls the jammed seatbelt theory, quote, a convenient excuse for panic-induced user error by negligent drivers looking for a quick payout. But, sitting in the smoky cabin of his wrecked car, panic wasn't the issue. Physics was. Under the crumpled hood, a spark from the severed battery cable danced across a pooling puddle of leaking power steering fluid. A small, bright orange flame flickered to life. Suddenly, the situation escalated from a bad accident to a ticking clock. Marcus began to pull frantically at the nylon webbing of the belt across his chest. The official police report, case file 88, Delta notes severe friction burns on his palms and fingers. He was fighting for his life against the exact safety device he had spent the last 8 months defending in print. The fire spread quickly, feeding on the dry, weed-choked embankment and the car's synthetic oil. The cabin began to fill with thick, acrid black smoke. It's chilling to pause and think about those final few minutes, the sheer, suffocating weight of the realization that must have washed over him. He wasn't just dying, he was being murdered by his own arrogance. As the heat intensified, spiderwebbing the windshield glass, Marcus was forced to stare down at the passenger floorboard. Scattered across the rubber mats were the printed drafts of his manuscript. The very pages where he called the auto manufacturer the victim of a witch hunt were now curling, browning, and catching fire. He was trapped in the exact, statistically impossible death trap he had staked his entire career on disproving. By the time the county volunteer fire department arrived on the scene, it was over. The Taurus was nothing but a charred, smoldering husk of American steel. The emotional fallout of this case is something that still haunts the local investigative community. When the first responders finally cut the roof away with the jaws of life, they didn't just find a tragic accident victim, they found a man whose right arm was fully extended toward the glove compartment, his charred fingers frozen just 3 inches away from the latch. Which brings us to the final, sickening aftershock of this whole story. During the post-crash investigation, detectives popped open that melted glove box. Inside, sitting perfectly intact beneath a pile of old registration papers and unpaid toll tickets, was an emergency glass breaker and seatbelt cutter tool. It was a cheap, promotional freebie Marcus had received at an automotive safety convention the year before. He had the tool to save his own life, but the defective seatbelt, the one he swore on his reputation would never fail, held him exactly 3 inches too short to reach it. And the ultimate irony? 6 months after his funeral, his publisher decided to release his book anyway. They marketed it as his final unfinished masterpiece. So today, right now, you can log online and buy a hardcover copy of Marcus's book. You can flip to page 142 and read a dead man arguing with absolute, unwavering certainty that the exact mechanical failure that burned him alive is nothing more than a myth. Splintered. The Staten Island House of Horrors. You know, when detectives talk about a messy crime scene, they usually mean a struggle, a knocked-over lamp, a rug pushed out of place, maybe some blood spatter on the baseboards. But the 2-story vinyl-sided house on Elmwood Park Drive in Staten Island wasn't just messy, it was excavated. End drywall was ripped out in jagged 3-foot chunks. The stuffing from the living room sofa was piled up like freshly fallen snow. Floorboards, solid oak floorboards, had been pried up with what looked like a heavy iron crowbar. And in the center of it all lay 5'8" Diane Gallagher. N.N. And honestly, the detectives standing in that suffocatingly hot room in mid-July weren't just asking who killed Diane. They were looking at the shredded walls, the smashed ceramic tiles, the absolute frantic destruction of a quiet middle-class home, and asking, what on earth were they looking for? N.N. But before we step inside that house, we need to understand who Diane was. Because the brutality of the scene just doesn't match the reality of her life. And Diane was a fixture in Great Kills, a quiet, working-class neighborhood on Staten Island's South Shore. She was a retired pediatric nurse, 58 years old. She had lived in that same house for almost 30 years. Her husband, Tom, had passed away from cancer 5 years prior. And since then, it was just her and a golden retriever named Buster. N.N. Her life was built on comfortable, mundane routines. She was the kind of neighbor who knew exactly when the street sweeper came by. Every morning at 7 a.m., she'd walk Buster down to the corner holding a large Dunkin' iced coffee. Her neighbors knew her schedule down to the minute. You'd hear the distant, steady hum of traffic from Highland Boulevard, the occasional roar of a lawnmower, the thud of the morning paper hitting the driveway. She was the neighbor who would grab your Amazon packages and put them behind your planter so they wouldn't get stolen. She was safe. She was deeply, profoundly normal. None, which brings us to Tuesday, August 12th. None. It's about 85 degrees out with that thick, oppressive East Coast humidity that makes the air feel heavy in your lungs. It's 4 p.m. Diane's next-door neighbor, a retired sanitation worker named Mike, is out front wrestling with a tangled garden hose. And he happens to glance over at Diane's driveway. Her silver Honda CR-V is parked there, right where it always is. But something is off. N. And at first, it's just a tiny detail, a minor glitch in the suburban matrix. Diane's trash cans are still sitting at the curb. The garbage truck came through at 10 a.m. Diane, times never times, leaves her cans out past noon. She was meticulous about it. N. Mike wipes the sweat off his forehead and walks over to pull the cans up her driveway. And that's when he notices the front door. N. It's open. Not wide open. Just cracked, maybe 2 or 3 inches. A stack of mail, junk mail, mostly, a couple of Valpak coupons, and a utility bill is wedged in the brass slot, fluttering slightly in the sluggish summer breeze. Mike stops. The neighborhood is suddenly very quiet. The hum of the traffic seems to fade into the background. He calls out her name. Diane? Nothing. At that point, it made sense to just assume she left it open for a breeze, or maybe she was in the backyard. People don't immediately jump to murder. We rationalize. We tell ourselves, it's nothing. N. But as Mike walks up the 3 concrete steps to her porch and pushes that heavy wooden door open, the first thing that hits him isn't a sight, it's a smell. A thick, suffocating wave of raw plaster dust, stale air, and the sharp, undeniable metallic scent of blood. Mike didn't want to step any further inside. Every instinct in his body was screaming at him to turn around, go back to his driveway, and call 911. But he had known Diane for 20 years. So he took a breath, pushed the door open a few more inches, and stepped into the foyer. The first thing he registered was the sound. It was the frantic, muffled scratching of dog paws coming from somewhere deep inside the house. Buster. Then his eyes adjusted to the dim light. What Mike saw didn't make sense. It was as if a localized tornado had touched down exclusively inside Diane's living room. The floral sofa, the one she kept meticulously vacuumed, was gutted. Foam stuffing was scattered across the hardwood floor like dirty snow. But it was the walls that made Mike freeze. The drywall had been ripped open. Huge, jagged sections of sheetrock were torn down to the wooden studs, exposing the pink fiberglass insulation and electrical wiring underneath. And then he looked down the hallway. Diane was lying near the entrance to the kitchen. We won't dwell on the gruesome details of the scene, but suffice it to say, it was immediately clear that she was gone. The violence inflicted upon her was staggering, completely incongruous with the quiet, sun-drenched suburban street outside. Mike stumbled backward, his heavy work boots crunching over chunks of plaster. He barely made it to the porch before he pulled out his cell phone with shaking hands. When the NYPD from the 122nd Precinct arrived, they taped off the perimeter, pushing the growing crowd of whispering neighbors back behind the police cruisers. Detectives stepped into the house, and immediately they formed a working theory. At that point, it made perfect sense. Staten Island, like a lot of American suburbs, was quietly battling a brutal opioid epidemic. Property crimes, specifically aggressive home invasions, had seen a sharp uptick. Junkies breaking in, looking for cash, jewelry, or prescription painkillers. It was a tragic, but common, narrative. The working theory was simple. A burglar breaks into the house, thinking it's empty. They are desperate, maybe high, tearing the place apart in a frantic search for a hidden safe or a stash of valuables. Diane comes home from her morning walk with Buster, catches the intruder in the act, and the burglar panics. It's a burglary gone horribly, tragically wrong. It's a neat explanation. It gives the chaos a shape. It's the kind of story that makes the neighbors lock their doors a little tighter at night, but ultimately lets them sleep, believing it was just a random, unlucky encounter. But honestly, the longer the crime scene investigators stayed in that house, the more that theory began to disintegrate. It started with the small things. The artifacts of the investigation that just didn't line up. If this was a desperate junkie tearing the house apart for quick cash, why was Diane's purse sitting right there on the kitchen island? Inside it, investigators found her wallet, completely untouched, with $400 in crisp $20 bills. They moved to the bedroom. Diane's jewelry box was sitting open on her dresser. Inside, her diamond engagement ring and a heavy gold necklace were sitting right on top. On the desk in the corner, a brand new $2,000 MacBook Pro was resting in plain sight. A panicked burglar doesn't leave behind untraceable cash and high-end electronics. And then there was the destruction itself. When the adrenaline faded and the detectives really looked at the damage, the frantic search theory completely collapsed. The walls weren't just smashed in a blind rage. When you looked closely at the edges of the ruined drywall, you could see straight, deliberate lines. Someone hadn't just taken a hammer to the walls, they had used a utility knife to score the sheetrock before prying it away in neat 3-foot sections. In the master bedroom, the heavy oak floorboards hadn't been randomly splintered. Someone had taken a crowbar and methodically popped them up one by one, exposing the subfloor beneath. This wasn't a frantic, panicked search. This was an excavation. Someone had spent hours in this house, dismantling it piece by piece. Which brings us to the most chilling detail of all. The detail that completely shatters the idea of a panicked intruder. When officers finally located Buster, the golden retriever, he wasn't cowering under a bed or injured. He was locked safely inside the downstairs half-bathroom. And sitting right next to him on the tile floor was a freshly filled bowl of water. A desperate burglar doesn't pause a frenzied home invasion to make sure the family dog is hydrated. The realization settled over the detectives like a heavy, suffocating blanket. The killer hadn't been surprised by Diane. They had dealt with Diane first. And then, with the homeowner dead on the floor and the dog safely locked away, they took their time. They weren't looking for cash. They were looking for something hidden inside the very bones of the house. And whatever it was, Diane had died because of it. When crime scene unit technicians finally peeled back the rest of the splintered drywall in the master bedroom, they found it. A rectangular cavity, exactly 14.5 inches wide, sitting flush between two wooden 2x4 studs. There were fresh scrape marks on the surrounding wood. 4 heavy-duty lag bolts lay discarded on the subfloor. Someone hadn't just been looking for something. They had known exactly what was there, a hidden wall safe. Detectives brought Diane's daughter, Emily, into the precinct. They asked her about the safe. Emily looked confused. She explained that her father, a retired Staten Island sanitation worker who passed away 5 years earlier, had installed a safe in the late 90s. He was an old-school guy who didn't entirely trust banks. He used to joke at family barbecues that his real retirement fund was in the walls. But Emily told them something else. Diane had emptied that safe years ago. She had moved the money into a mutual fund shortly after her husband died. So, who still thought the money was there? Who knew the exact layout of the house? And, more importantly, who did Buster the Golden Retriever know well enough to let them lock him in a bathroom without barking his head off and alerting the neighbors? It wasn't a sophisticated forensic dragnet that broke the case, it was a smudge. A single partial thumbprint lifted from the rim of Buster's stainless steel water bowl. When they ran it through the system, it didn't ping a career burglar or a desperate drifter. It pinged a 8-year-old local guy with a minor DUI record. His name was Tommy. He was Diane's nephew. And honestly, that's when the reality of this case shifts from a terrifying home invasion to something so much darker, because it means the killer didn't break in. He was invited. Let's reconstruct that Tuesday morning. Tommy knocks on the door around 9 a.m. Diane smiles, opens it, and lets her nephew in. We know this because investigators found a second coffee mug sitting in the kitchen sink, still containing a splash of French vanilla creamer, Diane's favorite. They sat at the kitchen island, they drank coffee. And at some point, Tommy, who had been quietly spiraling into gambling debt, asked for a loan. When Diane refused, the nephew she had babysat, the kid she bought Christmas presents for, picked up a heavy cast iron skillet from the stove. He didn't hesitate. After Diane fell, Tommy didn't panic. He calmly walked Buster to the half bath. He filled the water bowl, leaving that single thumbprint behind. And then he went out to his truck, grabbed his utility knife and a crowbar, and spent 3 hours methodically tearing his aunt's house apart, looking for a ghost fortune. For the family, Tommy's arrest wasn't a relief. It was a second death. The quiet Staten Island neighborhood where Diane lived, the kind of place where people leave their garage doors open and everyone knows everyone was fundamentally shattered, Emily didn't just lose her mother. She realized she had been sitting across the Thanksgiving table from her mother's murderer. The trial was a quiet, suffocating affair. Tommy sat there, staring blankly at the defense table, barely looking up when the judge handed down a life sentence without the possibility of parole. But there is one final detail about this case. A detail that stays with the detectives long after the file was boxed up and sent to the archives. When police executed a search warrant on Tommy's apartment, they found the walls safe in his garage. He had used an angle grinder to cut through the heavy steel door. The detectives looked inside, expecting to find something. But they found exactly what Emily had told them they would find. It was completely empty, except for a thin layer of dust and a small faded Polaroid photograph of Diane and her late husband tucked into the back corner. Tommy had murdered his aunt, dismantled her home, and destroyed his entire family for a metal box containing absolutely nothing. The Gainesville Shadow, the true origins of a slasher. Pop culture has a way of sanitizing real life. When most people think of the horror classic time Scream, they picture popcorn, jump scares, and a guy in a mass-produced Halloween mask taunting teenagers over a landline. It's fun. It's safe. But the real story, the actual events that made a young writer named Kevin Williamson lock all his doors and windows one night in 1990 while watching a TV special, didn't have a slick soundtrack or a neatly tied-up ending. It was quiet, it was sweaty, and it was horrifyingly real. N. Let's go back to late August, 1990. Gainesville, Florida. N. Honestly, if you've ever been to North Florida in August, you know exactly what the atmosphere is like. The humidity is oppressive. The air is so thick, it feels like you're breathing through a hot, wet towel. You have the constant droning hum of cicadas in the oak trees, and the rattling of cheap window AC units struggling to keep up with the heat. It was move-in week at the University of Florida. The town was buzzing with the chaotic energy of thousands of students returning for the fall semester. People were dragging heavy, awkward futons up narrow stairwells, eating leftover takeout pizza out of cardboard boxes, and sifting through piles of junk mail they didn't ask for. It's a very specific, mundane kind of joy. The messy reality of starting over. Nin. In a ground floor unit at the Williamsburg Village Apartments, one 8-year-old Sonia Larson and one 7-year-old Christina Powell were doing exactly that. They were freshmen, best friends from high school, just trying to settle in to their first taste of real independence. You know that feeling? The exhaustion of unpacking, the excitement of organizing a tiny closet, deciding where to put the TV. At the time, they were just two tired girls ready for the semester to begin. N. Now, at this point, everything feels perfectly safe. When you're a teenager in a bustling college town, surrounded by your peers, you feel insulated. You don't question the structural integrity of a cheap sliding glass door. You don't think twice about the dense, overgrown strip of woods just behind the apartment complex parking lot. And N, which actually mattered later. N. Because just beyond the tree line, hidden among the dense palmettos and draped Spanish moss, someone had quietly set up a campsite. N at T. First, the disturbances were completely microscopic. the kind of things anyone would naturally ignore. A faint rustling in the brush near the edge of the property line at dusk. A shadow shifting just outside the glow of the amber parking lot lights. If you're a student taking out the trash late at night, you might pause for a second. You might feel a brief, irrational prickle of fear on the back of your neck, but human nature kicks in. You rationalize it. You tell yourself it's just a stray dog looking for scraps, or the wind, or your own exhausted brain playing tricks on you. You shrug it off, turn around, and go back inside to the safety of your living room. But the man sitting in those woods wasn't a ghost, and he wasn't a theatrical movie villain. His name was Danny Rolling. He was a transient, a drifter with a deeply disturbed mind, sitting in the sweltering heat, drinking stale water and sweating through his clothes. He wasn't just resting in the trees. He was watching. He was patiently studying the routines of the girls in the ground floor apartment, learning exactly when their lights went out and noticing just how vulnerable a simple glass door could really be. The transition from an ordinary August night to a living nightmare didn't happen with a cinematic jump scare. It started with a mechanical click. Down in Florida, those cheap sliding glass doors on ground floor apartments are notorious. If you know what you're doing, you don't even need to break the glass. You just wedge a tool under the frame and silently pry the door up, right off its aluminum tracks. And honestly, if you're a teenager asleep in the next room with a cheap box fan humming loudly to fight off the suffocating late summer heat, you're never going to hear it. By the time the sun came up on the 24th of August, 1990, the Williamsburg Village apartments looked exactly the same as they had the day before. Students were walking to class, carrying heavy backpacks, complaining about the humidity, and drinking terrible dining hall coffee. But Christina and Sonia's parents hadn't heard from them. You know that very specific kind of anxiety. At first, you downplay it. You tell yourself, they're just busy. They're exhausted from moving. They're out exploring the campus. But after hours of calling, listening to the phone ring endlessly until the answering machine clicks over, that tight, cold feeling in your chest starts to take over. A wellness check was eventually called in. And when the police finally forced their way into that ground floor apartment, they didn't find a stylized horror movie set. They found a reality so profoundly gruesome, so methodically violent, that seasoned detectives had to immediately step back outside into the muggy parking lot just to catch their breath and process what they were looking at. Now, at this point, the police try to keep things quiet. That's standard procedure. You don't want to start a panic in a densely populated college town. They logically assumed this was a targeted attack. Maybe an aggrieved ex-boyfriend, or a localized burglary that had gone horribly, violently wrong. A terrible, but isolated, tragedy. But before they could even finish processing the scene, the bottom fell out of the investigation. The very next day, a 8-year-old student named Krista Hoyt didn't show up for her shift at the local sheriff's office. Police went to her duplex to check on her. Inside, they found a scene that completely shattered their initial theories. The killer hadn't just murdered Krista, he had taken his time, meticulously posing her body in a highly theatrical, deeply disturbed manner designed specifically to shock and traumatize whoever found her. Panic set in. Not a metaphorical panic, a suffocating, contagious fear that paralyzed the entire city of Gainesville. Hardware stores sold out of deadbolts, pepper spray, and baseball bats in a matter of hours. Students dragged their mattresses out of their bedrooms and into the center of their living rooms, sleeping in terrified groups of 10 with the lights blazing. And honestly, it was justified. Because just 2 days later, 2 more students, Manny Tabawada and Tracy Pales, were found dead in their apartment. The procedural messiness of a real investigation is that when you have a desperate, terrified public, you desperately need a suspect. The pressure from the media and the community is crushing. And almost immediately, the police found someone who fit the bill. His name was Edward Humphrey. He was an 8-year-old student who actually lived in the same apartment complex as 2 of the victims. He had a deeply scarred face from a car accident, suffered from severe untreated mental health struggles, and had recently been acting incredibly erratic, getting into shouting matches and wandering the complex at odd hours. He was the quintessential creepy guy that neighbors whisper about. It was the perfect narrative. The town latched onto it immediately. This times was the monster. It was a false explanation, but it made total sense to a terrified community. They had a troubled, violent kid in custody, the police were publicly focusing all their energy on him, and people finally let out a collective sigh of relief. The nightmare was over. Except, it wasn't over at all. Because as the detectives sat in their cramped, stale-smelling precinct offices, drinking day-old coffee and sifting through the horrific crime scene photos, the truth began to quietly collapse around them. The brutality of the murders, the sheer physical strength required to overpower someone like Manny Tabawada, who was a muscular college football prospect, combined with the meticulous, almost clinical cleanup of the crime scenes, did not match the profile of an erratic, disorganized teenager having a manic episode. The killer had used tape to bind his victims. He had left almost no usable fingerprints. He was literally washing his victims in the bathtub to destroy forensic evidence before slipping back into the night. Edward Humphrey was a tragic kid who desperately needed psychiatric help, but he wasn't a calculated, phantom-like predator. The chilling realization slowly washed over the task force, which actually mattered later because it meant all their early momentum was completely wasted. They had the wrong guy. And the man who had been patiently watching from the tree line, drinking stale water and quietly testing sliding glass doors, was entirely unknown to them. And he was still out there. The break in the case didn't come from a brilliant psychological profile or some cinematic shootout in the rain. It came from something painfully, frustratingly mundane. Just a few weeks later, and about 40 miles south in Ocala, a local guy tried to rob a grocery store. He botched it, fled in a stolen car, and ended up crashing. The local cops arrested him without much fanfare. His name was Danny Rolling. He was a 6-year-old drifter from Louisiana with a history of petty crime and an incredibly troubled past. Is less than BR, is greater than, is less than BR, is greater than. Now, at this point, nobody in Marion County thought they had just arrested the Gainesville Ripper. Why would they? He was just another sweaty, desperate guy in a holding cell, sitting under the harsh fluorescent lights, probably smelling like stale cigarettes and nervous sweat. At the time, this didn't seem strange. It was just another Tuesday night. Arrest is less than, BR is greater than, is less than, BR is greater than. But back in Gainesville, the task force was finally making a physical breakthrough. Behind the university campus, hidden in a dense, humid patch of woods that students walked past every single day without a second thought, police found a campsite. It wasn't some high-tech villain's lair. It was pathetically ordinary. A damp tent, some cheap stolen tools, half-eaten junk food wrappers, and a battery-powered cassette recorder. It was the messy, dirty reality of a serial killer. He hadn't been an untouchable mastermind. He had been living in the dirt, wiping his hands on his jeans, and quietly peering through the trees at the brightly lit apartment windows. Is less than BR, is greater than, is less than BR, is greater than. When crime scene technicians processed that damp campsite, they found evidence directly linking the camper to the Gainesville murders. And when they ran the serial numbers on the stolen items, it connected straight to the man sitting in the Ocala jail for a botched grocery store robbery. Danny Rolling is less than BR, is greater than, is less than. BR is greater than. The reveal of Danny Rolling completely shattered the illusion that monsters look like monsters. He was just a guy. And honestly, that was the hardest thing for the community to process. The emotional aftermath in Gainesville wasn't just heavy grief. It was a profound, lingering paranoia. For months afterward, students couldn't look at a sliding glass door without checking the locking mechanism 3 times. They couldn't walk past a line of trees on their way to class without wondering who was standing just out of sight, listening to the crunch of their footsteps. Is less than BR, is greater than, is less than BR, is greater than. But the final, truly haunting detail of this case, the aftershock that still echoes into pop culture today, came from that battery-powered cassette recorder found in his dirty tent. Rolling had recorded a tape for his family. On it, amidst rambling, self-pitying apologies and weirdly casual singing, he left an auditory footprint of a man who had completely detached from his own humanity. Is less than, BR is greater than, is less than, BR is greater than. A few years later, a struggling screenwriter named Kevin Williamson was watching a television special about Danny Rolling. It was late at night. The sheer, grounded terror of the Gainesville Ripper, the idea of a killer just watching through the window of a normal, quiet house, observing your mundane evening routine, creeped Williamson out so much that he paused the TV and went to check his own locks. As he walked through his house, he noticed an open window in his living room. He stared at it, frozen, realizing in a cold sweat how easily someone could just slip inside while he was sitting on the couch. Is less than BR, is greater than, is less than BR, is greater than. That exact feeling of domestic, helpless terror inspired him to sit down and write a script. He called it Scream. Is less than BR, is greater than, is less than, BR is greater than. And it's a deeply uncomfortable realization when you sit with it. We watch movies like Scream for a fun, thrilling scare, eating popcorn with our friends while a masked phantom stalks teenagers on screen. But the genesis of that phantom wasn't a fun Hollywood trope. It was a very real, very sweaty drifter, crouching in the damp Florida woods, patiently waiting for a tired college kid to forget to lock their sliding glass door. And knowing that is infinitely more terrifying. The 7-2, Our Wager. When a missing persons case hits a detective's desk, they usually look for the standard markers of a struggle: shattered glass, a dropped cell phone, maybe a smear of blood on the pavement. But when police found two 8-year-old Claire Vance's dark gray Honda Civic idling in the empty parking lot of a local nature reserve, there was no violence at all. The driver's side door was firmly shut. The heater was still blasting. Her purse was sitting neatly on the passenger seat, right next to a lukewarm cup of gas station coffee. The only thing out of place was a perfectly folded, heavy-stock paper card taped to the center of the steering wheel. Inside, typed in a neat clinical serif font, were 3 sentences. The game has begun. She has 72 hours to find the exit. If you try to intervene, the walls close early. Now, before we dive into the psychology of a man who treated human lives like disposable puzzle pieces, if you're the kind of person who eats a string cheese by biting directly into the center of it like a complete psychopath, go ahead and carefully detach the like button, dip it in room temperature milk, and stick it to the ceiling of your local DMV. It just feels right. Is less than BR is greater than, is less than BR is greater than. And honestly, looking back at Claire's life, there was absolutely nothing about her that would make her a target for this kind of elaborate, theatrical nightmare. She wasn't wealthy. She didn't have a high-profile job with dangerous enemies. Claire worked as an inventory manager at a mid-sized regional logistics firm in Ohio. Her days consisted of staring at spreadsheets, drinking stale break-room coffee, and driving home in the dark because it was mid-November and the sun set before 5 o'clock. She was the kind of person who kept a spare umbrella in her trunk and always double-checked that her front door was locked before going to bed. The mundane, ordinary rhythm of her life is actually what makes her case so deeply disturbing. It means this wasn't a crime of passion. It was a crime of selection. Is less than BR is greater than, is less than BR is greater than. The timeline of her disappearance starts on a Tuesday evening. It had been raining, freezing drizzle all afternoon, that miserable kind of Midwest weather that just sinks into your bones and makes everything look gray. Claire left the warehouse around 5:30 p.m. We know this because security cameras caught her pulling out of the employee lot, and later, detectives would trace her route, finding no deviations. She drove straight home to her duplex in a quiet, slightly older neighborhood with big oak tree and uneven sidewalks. At this point, the night feels perfectly, boringly normal. She parks in her driveway, grabs her purse, and walks up to her covered porch. But as she reaches for her keys, she notices something. There is a small, manila envelope resting perfectly in the center of her welcome mat. Is less than BR, is greater than, is less than BR, is greater than. Now, most people wouldn't immediately panic at the sight of an envelope, and Claire didn't either. She assumed it was a notice from her landlord or maybe a flyer for a local landscaping company that blew up onto the porch. She picked it up, unlocked her door, and went inside. She locked the deadbolt behind her, a habit so ingrained she probably didn't even register doing it. She dropped her keys in the little ceramic bowl by the door, took off her wet coat, and carried the envelope into the kitchen. The house was quiet, filled only with the hum of the refrigerator and the faint sound of cars hissing on the wet pavement outside. She turned on the overhead kitchen light, grabbed a butter knife, and sliced the envelope open. Inside was a single Polaroid photograph. Is less than BR, is greater than, is less than BR, is greater than. Claire pulled it out and stared at it. It was a picture of her own kitchen window, taken from the outside, looking in. But it wasn't an old photo. In the picture, the overhead kitchen light was on, and she could see the back of her own head standing exactly where she was standing right now, holding the envelope. The photograph had been taken seconds ago. Is less than BR, is greater than. Is less than BR, is greater than. It's in these quiet, terrifying moments that the human brain tries desperately to rationalize. You don't jump straight to the thought that a predator is hunting you. You think, is this a prank? Did one of my coworkers follow me home? Claire froze. Her heart started a heavy, slow thud against her ribs. She didn't scream. Instead, she did that deeply human, awkward thing. She slowly turned her head toward the kitchen window, almost afraid to look, hoping the yard would be empty. The glass was dark, reflecting only her own pale face and the yellow light of the kitchen. She couldn't see anything out in the rainy yard. But then, her phone buzzed on the counter. A text message from an unknown number. It read, "Good. You're paying attention. The front door is now locked from the outside. Don't try the windows. Rule number 1. You have to play." Now, if you're hearing this, you're probably yelling at the story in your head. You're thinking, break the glass. Call 911. Scream until the neighbors hear you. But honestly, true panic doesn't usually look like a Hollywood movie. It's quieter. It's heavier. Claire dropped her phone. It clattered hard against the laminate kitchen counter, and she did the only thing her stunned brain could process. She ran to the front door. She grabbed the brass handle and twisted. The deadbolt was unlocked, the knob turned freely, but the door wouldn't budge. She pushed her shoulder against the heavy wood, but it felt like pushing against a brick wall. From the other side, through the thin gaps in the doorframe, she heard the thick, mechanical clicking of a heavy-duty ratchet strap being tightened. He had strapped the exterior doorknob to the structural pillar of her porch. She was sealed in. She backed away, her breathing turning shallow and fast, and sprinted into the living room to try the front-facing window. She unlatched the lock and shoved upward. Nothing. She pushed harder, her palms sweating against the vinyl frame, but it was completely immobilized. And that's when she looked closer at the frame. Driven straight through the vinyl, deep into the wooden studs of the wall, were 4 heavy-gauge construction screws. They were new. The metal shavings were still sitting on her windowsill. He hadn't just followed her home. He had been here for hours, quietly altering her house while she was at work. She grabbed a heavy brass lamp from the end table, her knuckles white. She was going to smash the pane. But as she raised it, her phone, still sitting on the kitchen counter, pinged again. A second text. It echoed in the quiet house. She didn't want to look. She wanted to smash the glass. But the psychological hold was already working. She slowly walked back to the kitchen, leaving the lamp on the couch, and picked up the phone. "Look down," the message read. Claire looked down at the floorboards directly beneath the kitchen window. Tucked into the corner, half hidden behind a potted fern, was a cheap, battery-operated baby monitor. The little green power light was on. He was listening to her breathe. A third text immediately followed. "Break the glass and I come in. Play the game and you live until morning. Go to the hallway closet. Top shelf. We don't know exactly how long Claire stood there in the dark, staring at that little plastic baby monitor, but based on the forensic timeline unearthed much later, she spent the next 4 hours participating in a psychological torture chamber inside the very place she was supposed to feel safest. When Detective Eris Thorne walked into Claire's duplex 2 days later, he wasn't looking for a crime scene. It was a standard wellness check requested by her nursing supervisor after she missed 2 consecutive shifts. But as Thorne stepped through the back door, which the fire department had to pry open with a Halligan bar, the smell hit him immediately. It was a thick, metallic tang of copper mixed with the stale, sour odor of old adrenaline and sweat. Claire was gone. The house was dead quiet, save for the hum of the refrigerator. But the living room looked like the aftermath of a bizarre, ritualistic tornado. Furniture was pushed against the walls. The carpets had been meticulously rolled up, and placed in the dead center of the bare wooden floor was a digital kitchen timer, perfectly zeroed out, surrounded by a circle of 6 more Polaroid photographs. Thorne picked one up, using his pen. It was a photo of Claire, crying, holding a pair of heavy garden shears, staring at the camera. In the background of the photo, Thorne could see her own living room clock. The time was 3:14 a.m. Now, at this point in an investigation, real life is messy. Detectives don't immediately leap to the idea of a sophisticated, game-playing serial predator. They look at the statistics. And statistically, when a woman vanishes from a locked home with signs of a struggle, you look at the men in her life. Thorne and his partner canvassed the neighborhood, digging through stale coffee and junk mail back at the precinct, piecing together Claire's recent history. And they found a glaring, neon red flag. 6 months prior, Claire had broken up with a guy named Mark. Mark was bad news, a volatile construction contractor with a history of domestic disputes and a recently expired restraining order Claire had filed against him. He had the tools to drill screws into window frames. He had the ratchet straps. And just a week before Claire vanished, Mark had left a drunk, rambling voicemail on her phone, ending with the words, "You'll see what it feels like to be locked out." It was neat. It was logical. It gave the terrifying, chaotic scene at the duplex a grounded, understandable face. The detectives thought they had their guy. They dragged Mark into the fluorescent-lit interrogation room of the precinct later that night. Thorne laid out the photos of Claire's barricaded house. Mark was sweating profusely. He was shaking, stumbling over his words, and avoiding eye contact. He was acting exactly the way a guilty man acts when the walls are closing in. Thorne leaned over the table, pressing him, waiting for the confession to spill. But here's the catch. And it's the kind of procedural wall that haunts investigators. Mark wasn't sweating because he kidnapped Claire. He was sweating because he was a mid-level amphetamine distributor who thought Thorne had just busted him for a drug run. When Thorne finally pushed hard enough, Mark cracked, but not about Claire. He gave up his alibi, terrified but desperate to avoid a murder charge. Mark had been sitting in the back room of an illegal poker game behind a strip mall 80 miles away on the night Claire disappeared. The police pulled the security footage from the alleyway. And there was Mark, smoking a cigarette on camera at the exact moment the Polaroids of Claire were being taken in her kitchen. Thorne sat at his desk, staring at the security stills, a cold knot forming in his stomach. The clean narrative collapsed entirely. Mark was a dead end. This wasn't an angry ex-boyfriend. This wasn't a crime of passion. And as Thorne sat there, rubbing his tired eyes, his desk phone rang. It was dispatch. They had another scene. Across town, in a wealthy, gated suburb, a landscaper had just found his client's front door strapped shut from the outside. Thorne felt all the blood leave his face. He realized they weren't dealing with a stalker. They were dealing with a ghost who was just getting started. And this time, when Thorne arrived at the second house, he found out what happens when a victim refuses to play the game. And honestly, this is the moment in the timeline where the case shifted from a localized tragedy into a full-blown nightmare. It's the point where seasoned cops stop trusting their own instincts. Now at this point, Thorne was running on stale coffee and pure adrenaline. He pulls into this neighborhood called Oak Creek. It's the kind of pristine, heavily governed subdivision where the biggest neighborhood crisis is someone leaving their trash cans out a day too long. It's 9 a.m. The sky is a brilliant, ignorant blue. A rogue lawn sprinkler is lazily ticking back and forth across a perfectly manicured yard. The mundane reality of the environment actually made the whole thing feel so much worse. The landscaper, a college kid holding a rake, was sitting on the curb, pale as a sheet, just pointing a trembling hand at the front door. And there they were. Two heavy yellow ratchet straps bolted directly into the brickwork, holding the front door flush against the frame. Same hardware, same method. Thorn and his partner cut the straps and drew their weapons. The smell hit them the second the door cracked open. It's that horrible, unforgettable mix of stale air, Glade plugins, and the sharp, metallic tang of deep arterial blood. The victim was a 2-year-old tax attorney named David Hirsch. But unlike Claire's house, which was eerily neat, David's house was a war zone. Lamps were shattered. The drywall in the hallway was punched in. A heavy, iron fire poker lay bent on the carpet. David hadn't just waited patiently. He had refused to play whatever sick game this ghost had set up. He had fought back. They found him lying in the hallway, connecting the kitchen to the back patio. The sliding glass door behind him was completely shattered. At first glance, the narrative seemed obvious. The detectives logged it as a frantic escape attempt. They assumed David tried to smash his way out into the backyard, and the killer caught him from behind. It made sense. At least it made sense for about 20 minutes. But this is where the procedural messiness of real police work rears its head. Thorn knelt down by the sliding glass door and looked at the shards. The glass wasn't on the patio. All the broken glass was pushed inward, scattered across the kitchen tile. The door hadn't been broken from the inside. Someone had smashed it from the outside to get in. And when Thorn looked closer at the latch, a cold knot formed in his stomach. The door was already unlocked. The clean narrative collapsed entirely. If the killer broke in from the backyard, why did he strap the front door shut from the outside? It took Thorn 3 hours to find the answer, and it came in the form of a piece of evidence so mundane it almost got overlooked. While canvassing the front yard, checking the mulch for footprints, Thorn noticed a black plastic bag tucked behind a rhododendron bush directly beneath the front window. Inside the bag was an old, cheap, scuffed-up Sony cassette player. It was wired to a pair of bulky, battery-powered external speakers. Thorn put on latex gloves, rewound the tape, and hit play. For the first few seconds, there was just tape hiss. And then, deafeningly loud through the speakers, came the grinding, unmistakable sound of a power drill. Then, the heavy thud of boots on a wooden porch. Then, the rhythmic, metallic crank of a ratchet strap tightening. Then, a man's voice, muffled and angry, swearing as he supposedly rattled the front doorknob. Thorn froze. He stopped the tape. He played it again. And then, the terrifying, brilliant cruelty of the trap finally dawned on him. The killer wasn't standing on the porch terrifying his victims. He wasn't a voyeur. He was a trapper. He had simply planted the tape recorder in the bushes on a timer. The terrifying noises of the house being barricaded, the drills, the footsteps, it was all pre-recorded audio. It was a hunting blind. The killer uses the audio to simulate a violent break-in at the front of the house. The victim wakes up, absolutely paralyzed with fear. They hear someone drilling their front door shut. What is the natural, unavoidable human instinct? You back away from the noise. You retreat. You slowly backpedal down your hallway, eyes locked in terror on your front door, retreating into the deepest, darkest, supposedly safest part of your house. But while the tape is playing loudly on the front porch, drawing all of the victim's panicked attention, the killer is already inside. He had slipped in silently through an unlocked back window hours earlier. He wasn't trying to break in. He was just standing in the dark at the end of the hallway, waiting for you to slowly, blindly back right into him. Thorn had to sit down on the curb. His mind flashed immediately back to Claire's house. He thought about those scattered Polaroids. The final, blurry photo of her dark hallway. She wasn't taking a picture of an intruder. She was taking a flash photograph to see if the front door was secure, backing away from the phantom noises on her porch, holding a kitchen knife, completely unaware that the killer had already stepped out of her bathroom right behind her. The emotional toll of that realization of Claire's absolute, agonizing vulnerability in her final moments hung over the department like a suffocating blanket. The houses would eventually be cleaned, the straps removed, the neighborhoods returning to their quiet routines, but the psychological rot remained. And the final detail, the one that still keeps Thorne awake at night, came a week later when the audio forensics lab cleaned up the cassette tape found in David's bushes. They listened to the whole 45-minute recording. It was just an endless, looping loop of terrifying break-in sounds. But right at the 43-minute mark, the sound effects abruptly cut out. There was 10 seconds of dead, static air. And then, a calm, deeply ordinary male voice leaned right into the microphone. It didn't sound like a monster. It sounded like a neighbor asking to borrow a shovel. He just whispered, "You can turn around now." The Phantom of Heilbronn, the woman without a face. Here is a terrifying thought. You are hunting a killer. She is brutal, she is unpredictable, and she is completely invisible. Over the course of 15 years, she commits murders. She commits robberies. She breaks into homes across Germany, Austria, and France. She leaves her DNA at 40 different crime scenes. 40. But no one has ever seen her. No security camera has ever caught her face. No witness can describe her. The press dubbed her the woman without a face. And honestly, for a long time, investigators thought they were chasing a literal ghost. To understand how this nightmare started, we have to go back to the 23rd of May 1993. Idar Oberstein. It is a quiet, working-class town in southwestern Germany, the kind of place where the biggest daily drama is a neighbor parking a few inches too close to your driveway. The local police precinct smells like stale cigarette smoke and cheap drip coffee. It is a quiet Sunday morning. Lieslot Schlenger, a 62-year-old woman, is found dead in her living room, strangled. The weapon? A simple piece of wire. Now, at first glance, it looks like a robbery gone wrong. But real crime scenes are not like the movies. They are messy. They are chaotic collections of unopened junk mail, half-empty mugs, and misplaced everyday items. Investigators comb through the apartment, and right there, near Lieslot's body, they find a teacup. It is totally ordinary. But when they swab it, they get a hit. DNA. Female DNA. At that point, it made sense. The detectives thought, "Great, we have our killer. It is just a matter of time." They log the DNA into the database, file the paperwork in a thick manila folder, and wait for a match. But the match never comes. The case goes cold. For 8 long years, that DNA profile just sits in a dusty digital archive, a forgotten string of genetic code, until March 2001, when suddenly the system pings, and the ghost comes back to life. March 2001, Freiburg, Germany, about 130 miles south of our first crime scene. A 1-year-old man is found dead, strangled, just like Lieslot. The police dust the scene, and they find a single, distinct fingerprint on a kitchen drawer. They swab it. The DNA matches our ghost. N.N. Now, the detectives are sitting up. 2 murders, 8 years apart. Both victims in their 60s, both strangled. It is terrifying, sure, but it is also a pattern, and cops love patterns. They think, okay, we have a female serial killer. They start profiling her. They imagine a cold, calculating woman, someone who blends in, a nurse maybe, or a caretaker, someone invisible. N.N. But then the Phantom changes the rules. N.N. In October 2001, her DNA is found on a discarded heroin syringe in a wooded patch near Gerolstein, A few weeks later, it is on a half-eaten cookie left behind after a trailer park burglary. Then, it shows up on a toy pistol used to rob a Vietnamese gem trader in France. Then, a stolen car in Austria. Then, a smashed window at a local optical shop. End. Honestly, if you are an investigator looking at this, your head is spinning. The map of her crimes looks like someone loaded a shotgun with red pushpins and just fired it at a map of Central Europe. She is everywhere. She is a ruthless killer. She is a petty thief. She is a heroin addict. She is robbing optical stores and stealing cars. And which brings us to the false explanation. Because human beings, especially detectives running on 3 hours of sleep and bad diner coffee, need things to make sense. The working theory shifts. The police decide they aren't looking for a lone, calculating mastermind. They are looking for a transient, a drifter, probably someone deeply entrenched in the criminal underworld, maybe doing contract work for Eastern European gangs. She travels constantly. She lives off the grid. That is why no one can identify her. It is a solid, logical theory. And accept. It is completely wrong. The escalation reaches its absolute peak on the 25th of April 2007, Heilbronn, Germany. A 22-year-old police officer named Michelle Kaiserwetter is taking a lunch break in her patrol car with her partner. It is a warm spring day. They are just sitting there, completely relaxed. Suddenly, two figures approach the vehicle from behind. They draw weapons. They fire point blank into the cruiser. Michelle is killed instantly. Her partner is critically wounded. NIT is a brutal, brazen execution, a national tragedy. The German police force goes into overdrive. They tear the crime scene apart, swabbing every square inch of that patrol car. And on the back seat, right there on the upholstery, they find it. The DNA of the woman without a face. Now. She isn't just a burglar or a serial killer. She is a cop killer. The bounty on her head skyrockets to 300,000 euros. The media is in an absolute frenzy. The Phantom of Heilbronn is the most dangerous woman in Europe. End pawn. But right when the hunt reaches its fever pitch, the truth starts to collapse. Number 2. 2008, investigators get a DNA hit from a crime scene in Saarbrücken. It is a pool of blood left behind after a vicious bar fight. The DNA matches the Phantom, but there is a massive problem. Witnesses, security cameras, and the sheer physical evidence all confirm one undeniable fact: the blood belongs to a man, a biological male. N. Detectives stare at the lab report, completely stunned. How can a female ghost leave male blood? The contradictions don't stop there. A few months later, her DNA is found on a rock used to smash a window in one town. But on that exact same night, her DNA is recovered from a break-in over 400 miles away. Unless this heroin-addicted, cop-killing drifter has access to a teleportation device, the timeline is physically impossible. The neat little theory of the transient gang member shatters into a million pieces. The investigators are left staring at a corkboard that defies the laws of space, time, and biology. They aren't hunting a master criminal anymore. They are hunting an impossibility. And honestly, this is the point where the entire investigation just stops. It hits a brick wall of pure, undeniable absurdity. You have hundreds of the best detectives in Europe staring at a map with pushpins that literally contradict the laws of physics. They are exhausted, they are humiliated, and frankly, they are desperate. It is March 2009. The police finally decide to do something they probably should have done years ago. They stop looking at the crime scenes, and they start looking at how they are processing the crime scenes. They look at the tools, specifically the cotton swabs. Now, keep in mind, police use these highly specialized, double-packaged cotton swabs to collect DNA. They buy them from a specific medical supply company in mainland Europe, a facility that prides itself on being sterile. Investigators decide to pay a visit to this factory. They start swabbing the factory workers, the people on the assembly line, and there it is, a ping, a 100% undeniable DNA match. The Phantom of Heilbronn, the woman without a face. The ruthless, teleporting, heroin-addicted cop killer who had terrorized a continent and racked up a massive bounty. She wasn't a mastermind. She wasn't a drifter. She wasn't even a criminal. She was a one-year-old Polish immigrant, an elderly woman working a minimum wage job on a packaging line at a medical supply factory in Bavaria. Let that sink in for a second. For over 15 years, this elderly woman had just been coming to work, drinking her morning coffee, and packing cotton swabs into plastic tubes. And because the factory's sterilization process killed bacteria and viruses, but did not destroy human DNA, every time she accidentally touched a swab without gloves, or coughed, or shed a microscopic skin cell, she was framing herself for murder. The police weren't tracking a serial killer, they were tracking their own contaminated equipment. The fallout is, well, catastrophic. Doesn't even begin to cover it. It is a profound, historic embarrassment. Authorities had squandered over 16,000 hours of manpower. They had blown millions of dollars chasing a ghost. But the real tragedy? The emotional wreckage left behind. Think about the family of Michelle Kiesewetter, the 22-year-old police officer executed in her patrol car. For 2 years, her family was told, "We have her DNA. We are closing in on the killer." To sit those parents down and tell them, "We were wrong. We have absolutely nothing." That is a devastating conversation. And because the police were so blindly focused on the Phantom, the real killers who turned out to be a violent, far-right domestic terror cell were able to slip away and continue their reign of terror for years. Which brings us to the final unsettling truth of this whole ordeal. We watch these true crime documentaries, and we are conditioned to believe that DNA is gospel. It is the ultimate truth, the silver bullet. But science is only as flawless as the messy, careless humans administering it. Somewhere out there right now, there is a detective holding a plastic bag. Inside that bag is a piece of evidence that could send someone to prison for the rest of their life, or send a task force on a decade-long wild goose chase. And it all hinges on whether or not the person who made the bag happened to sneeze.